I hadn't planned on doing any more presentations on the basics of logic, but after reviewing the last couple of programs, I realized that I wasn't entirely clear on some very important terms. Specifically, the definition of premise in contradistinction to conclusion just didn't come off as clearly as I would have liked it to. And you need a working knowledge of the word premise in order to be able to evaluate an argument successfully. In the last video, I defined a premise as a proposition upon which an argument is based or from which a conclusion is drawn. Now, that is a valid definition. However, there are other definitions out there, and I think by looking at multiple definitions, you get a clearer idea as to what is meant by the word premise in different contexts. What is the difference between premise and conclusion in an argument? Premises are statements that directly support the conclusion. As you can see in the slide, the premise is the rock upon which your conclusion is hanging. Were there no rock there, our guy would be falling. There would be no conclusion, no justifiable conclusion at least. Here's another valid definition of the word premise. A premise is the starting point of an argument, or the foundation of an argument. The conclusion logically follows from the premise, or it could be considered as a roof to the foundation. The premise, of course, being the foundation, conclusion being the roof, built on the foundation. Were it not for the foundation and the walls, which are the supporting arguments, the conclusion could not be a roof for it. Many arguments are in the if-then format. If your premises are true, then your conclusion can be logically inferred. Another definition: the premise is the basis of the dispute. The conclusion is the resolution of the dispute. The premises are what you start with. You know them ahead of time. Or you assume them for the purposes of the argument. You presume that everybody involved in the argument understands these particular premises to be true. The conclusion is what is the end result that you can deduce. What are some types of arguments? A simple argument has two premises and one conclusion. A more complex argument may contain many arguments, but these can always be divided up into groups of three: two premises and a conclusion. Now here's a definition we probably should have looked at earlier. What is an argument? Think about it. What is an argument? What do you think an argument is? The definition of an argument is a series of statements that are used to persuade somebody of something. That's what an argument is. That something is called the conclusion or the major claim. Okay? The first job in analyzing any argument is to identify the conclusion. In an argument, the conclusion is only supported by its two premises, but each premises can be supported in a number of ways. These include supporting arguments, assumptions, evidence. Okay, evidence, big time. Don't forget evidence. Okay, evidence, authority, as well as explanations and anecdotes. A supporting argument is one which has as its conclusion the same statement as the premise being supported. I'll get into an example shortly. All premises can be supported in this way, but such supporting arguments are often not stated. A special type of supporting argument is a definition, and while these two are usually unstated, at times it's necessary to define a term because either the term itself or the particular denotation being used is unusual. Consider the following argument. Employers should allow their employees to access Facebook and Twitter at work. Now, one supporting argument that I have seen to this argument is that employees are going to access Twitter and Facebook with their smartphones anyway, and it's just a matter of time. So there's an example of supporting argument. Here's another argument. Easy credit promotes obesity. A supporting argument to that is that only 14% of American grocery store purchases are made with cash. Therefore, it does appear that easy credit promotes obesity. The supporting argument and the argument have the same conclusion. Okay. Another kind of premise, assumptions. Eventually, all support for premises can be traced back to a set of beliefs which the person making the argument considers to be self-evident, and therefore not in need of further support or analysis. These may be called assumptions, presumptions, suppositions, or in certain situations, postulates or axioms. Such assumptions serve as the premises for supporting arguments, and in general, any premise can be called an assumption. For example, the sun is usually found in the sky. That's an assumption that we assume everybody will agree with. A premise can be made a lot more acceptable when it's supported by various kinds of evidence. Statistical studies, historical information, physical evidence, observations or experiments, eyewitness accounts, and so on. The relative strength of evidence is determined by how reliable a person believes it to be. Almost no evidence is beyond dispute. We might challenge the methodology of the study, the accuracy of the information, the manner in which physical evidence was collected, and the eyesight or motivation of the witnesses. And remember that the evidence only supports the premises. Evidence cannot be an argument itself. Consider the next type of premise, authority. Sometimes we're not in a position to judge supporting evidence for ourselves. There may simply be too much of it, or it may be too technical in nature, or it may not be directly available to us. In those cases, we often rely on the judgments of others, authorities, whom we believe to be more likely to come to an accurate evaluation of the evidence than we are ourselves. Though we tend to think of such expertise in scientific, medical, or other scholarly fields, authority in arguments can also come from religious teachings, from folk wisdom and popular sayings, anything or anyone that we accept as somehow able to reach a more accurate evaluation. The relative strength of an authority in an argument depends on how willing a person is to accept the judgment of that source. But even in the strongest cases, use of an authority merely supports a premise and does not make an argument by itself.
Apparently alien human hybrids include George Bush, Tony Blair, and even the Queen of England. And we thought she was just German. They are all descendants of the original alien hybrids.
What you have, in effect, is the Illuminati families being the genetic representatives on this planet of these serpent gods.
Serpents? Yes, the aliens who came down to Earth long, long ago didn't look like the Queen of England. In fact, they were serpent, lizardy sorts. And even when they interbred, the old reptile bit just wouldn't disappear.
Well, I think the answer to why reptiles is why not. It's just the form through which people express themselves, or entities of consciousness expresses themselves.
The Illuminati cover up their reptilian nature with a human disguise. But occasionally, though, the effort of hiding their slithery selves becomes too much, and the mask drops.
Let me see what you really are.
People find it difficult to perceive of a two-legged reptilian entity with what we would call an intelligent mind. But I have talked to hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world. I've been to more than 40 countries researching this, who have told me the same basic recurring story of seeing people, often in positions of power, but not always, change from a human into a reptilian form and then go back again. Sometimes it's for a few seconds, sometimes it's for longer.
Ike's theory has turned him into a superstar in the conspiracy world.
Sometimes we're more willing to accept a premise if we are given background information or specific examples that help explain that premise. Such explanations and accounts are not given the importance of evidence or authority in an argument. Anecdotal evidence, for example, is by definition less statistically reliable than other sorts of evidence, and explanations do not carry the weight of authority. But both anecdotal evidence and explanations may affect our understanding of a premise and therefore influence our judgment. The relative strength of an explanation or anecdote is usually a function of its clarity and applicability to the premise it's supporting. Okay, we've just gone over 5 types of evidences, 5 types of premises. Are they all weighted equally? Is this an egalitarian situation where we consider them all the same? No, there is a hierarchy of evidence. The various sorts of support for a premise, supporting arguments, evidence, authority, and explanations and anecdotes interact in what we might call a hierarchy of support or evidence, in which one sort is given priority over another. In a murder trial, for example, the prosecution is usually based on the assumption that the jury's hierarchy of evidence will have at the top physical evidence, things like fingerprints, blood samples, especially as explained by technical authorities, forensic pathologists, ballistic experts, followed by eyewitness accounts, and then other sorts of authorities such as psychologists, sociologists, and finally by explanations and anecdotes. This would include character witness or personal histories. If the prosecution is right, their strong physical evidence and the eyewitness accounts will outweigh the defendant's character witnesses because of their relative placement in the jury's hierarchy of evidence. However, because that hierarchy is determined by each individual on a case-by-case basis, one can never be totally sure how any one piece of support will be accepted. By definition, anecdotal evidence is gathered in an unscientific manner, usually based on someone's personal experiences. And while the anecdote may be true, there's no way to tell whether those personal experiences are common or very rare. Of course, bad evidence may not be statistically reliable either, but it is presented as if it were. Here's a question. In a murder trial, which of the following would usually be placed lowest in the hierarchy of evidence? A. Fingerprints on the murder weapon. B. An eyewitness account of the crime. C. The defendant's prior criminal record. Or D. A psychiatrist's report on the defendant's ability to tell right from wrong. And the answer is C, the defendant's prior criminal record. While a prior criminal record or lack of a criminal record may seem to tell a lot about the character of the defendant, it's usually inadmissible as evidence for the simple reason that the truth of the charges must be proven with evidence of that specific crime. The prior criminal record of a defendant or lack of a criminal record is usually excluded as prejudicial in determining guilt or innocence, although it is often considered in determining the sentence once an individual has been convicted of a crime. Very often in a debate, the various debaters will often cheat by interjecting irrelevant premises. These are considered fallacious arguments, and it's important that you understand that when you're taking a look at a debate. You don't just want to know who has a good argument and a bad argument. You want to know who resorts to cheating, who resorts to the use of fallacious arguments. Now, the most common fallacious argument that is very often used is something called the ad hominem fallacy. The most common fallacy that is often introduced in a debate is the ad hominem fallacy. Whenever the debater introduces irrelevant personal premises about the opponent, that is called an ad hominem fallacy. Such red herrings may successfully distract the opponent or the audience from the topic of the debate. In Latin, it is called argumentum ad hominem, and is specifically translated argument against the man. And again, the debater commits the ad hominem fallacy whenever he introduces irrelevant personal premises about his opponent. Ad hominem is the most familiar of informal fallacies, and with the possible exception of undistributed middle, it's the most familiar logical fallacy of them all. It's also one of the most used and abused of fallacies. Here we see an example of argumentum ad hominem. People who oppose Obama's healthcare program are an angry mob. Okay, nobody was arrested in this particular shot. People were upset, and they vocalized their opinion. Nobody was killed, nobody was lynched, but there were references to this group as an angry mob, which would be considered argumentum ad hominem. The fallacy of the undistributed middle is a logical fallacy that is committed when the middle term in a categorical syllogism isn't distributed. Now that's going to need some definition. Okay, let's say you have this given, that all z's are b's and that y is a b. Now if you conclude that y is therefore a z, that would be considered the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Okay. Here's another one that'll probably make a little bit more sense to you. All atheists are born on earth. Italians are born on earth. Therefore, all Italians are atheists. So this concludes my section on logic. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope that now you do have a better understanding. You have greater confidence in your understanding of conclusion and premise. Hopefully you understand the supporting evidences for a premise, what makes up premises. Hopefully you also understand the types of arguments that are out there, that you're able to recognize the most common fallacious arguments, the ad hominem and undistributed middle. If you do, then this next section will make a lot more sense when we take apart the arguments of the, Precocious Atheist in the next section. Thanks for bearing with me as long as you have, and let's move on to the next section. We're ready.